The Aryan Brotherhood inside Louisiana prisons. Does it exist? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that once you hear what I have to say and my personal experience with the Aryan Brotherhood inside Louisiana prisons. The first time that I met an Aryan Brotherhood member was in 1996 in Hunt Correctional Facility, which is the receiving diagnostic center for the state of Louisiana before you get transferred to wherever they're going to send you to do your time, whether that be Hunt, Angola, David Wade Correctional Center, WCI, DCI, etc., etc. The topic can get complicated, so before we jump into the Aryan Brotherhood member that I met, I want to go back a little bit further to the year 1995, when I was in a street gang right outside of New Orleans in a place called Jefferson Parish, Metairie, Louisiana to be exact. And we were in a gang called the Metairie Bloods. And the Metairie Bloods were actually a couple gangs that were mixed up into one gang. And I specifically was in a gang called the Snowmen Crew. And I guess if you dig deep enough into the Times-Picayune archives, you can definitely find old newspaper clippings and articles about the Snowmen Crew and the Metairie Bloods. They do exist. I just don't know how to find them. Anyway, this is back in 1995, and there was a newspaper article about the Metairie Bloods. It was a gang that I was in. Now, I make no such claim as a grown man who done prison time and went through life and all the hell that life throws at you to say that I was any official blood. Of course, we were what you might call jump claiming it, right? That's just what it is. Because to be in a gang like the Bloods, for me, to show respect to the true gang members who created those gangs, you have to be sanctioned. And in Louisiana, as far as I know, no California members ever came to Louisiana in New Orleans or in Jefferson Parish to sanction anybody that I knew to actually run a set for the Bloods. So let's clear that out the way. We were just young teenagers jump claiming. Now, some people went into adulthood and they still claiming it. So I guess to them, it's as real as can be. But for me, we were just criminals and we wanted to belong to something. And we were doing all the stuff that I guess the Bloods do. We were doing drive-by shootings. We were shooting people. We were robbing. We were stealing. We were slanging. And we were banging. We were doing stuff that we had no business doing. That's why most of us wound up in prison. Some of us are still in prison today. And some of us ain't even alive. But here I am, a success story. And now I want to tell you where my personal encounter with the Aryan Brotherhood inside Louisiana prison started. When the Times-Picayune put out a newspaper article about us on the front page around 1995, it was all mostly, we didn't have all white members, but most of the members that we had that were in the Metairie Bloods were white. Now we had probably, they had black members too, but a lot of the black dudes in black neighborhoods, they ran their own sets, so we were mixed. We had whites, blacks, Vietnamese, and Spanish in our set. And they ran an article in the Times-Picayune, but most of the people that they showed inside the Times-Picayune article about the Metairie Bloods were all white. And this was a time when Harry Lee, and if you don't know nothing about Harry Lee, he was the only Chinese sheriff in the United States of America, and he was a sheriff out of Jefferson Parish, right next to New Orleans, very big parish. And Harry Lee didn't play no games, and he was coming after all the gang members in the 1990s because if you know anything about New Orleans, in New Orleans, the prison systems were the worst. New Orleans City had the highest murder rate in the entire country, probably the entire world. I remember there was one article about New Orleans in the Times-Picayune, and it compared New Orleans to third world countries that had civil wars going on like Burma. And in certain parts of the city, like in the St. Thomas projects, I remember reading an article as a teenager. There was dots for every murder, and they were saying there were more murders and unalivings in the St. Thomas projects in uptown New Orleans and in other places like the Ninth Ward than there was in war-torn countries. That's how bad New Orleans was. So you got to think, everywhere you go, this was the inner city. And even outside the inner city in the suburbs of New Orleans, like places like Jefferson Parish, this stuff was spilling over. And so even in the neighborhoods, the middle-class neighborhoods to poor to middle-class neighborhoods, the kids were involving themselves with gangs and crime. Everybody was doing it. Everybody was going. Juvenile detention was filled with whites and blacks and Vietnamese. I didn't know a lot of Spanish early on until I went to Metairie, because on the West Bank of New Orleans, there was mainly Vietnamese, blacks, and whites. And so there was this article. And one of the members who was in the Metairie Bloods, his name was plastered inside the article. And somehow or another, the Aryan Brotherhood reads this article. This is the exact information I have as is, not elaborated, not exaggerated, plain, simple, and uninteresting or interesting. You decide that, and you can decide if the person we spoke to was actually sanctioned Aryan Brotherhood from the feds or from California or from Texas. I don't know. But we had someone call, one of the guys whose names was in the paper, and we were around 17, 18 years old at this time. Some of us were 16, 17, 18, 19 years old. That was around our age range when this article came out. And somehow or another, somebody got the phone number who was in the Aryan Brotherhood and called one of the members. He called a gang meeting, and we all met, all the key shot callers who were in the Metairie Bloods, as us as teenagers. We all met. And he said, look, I got a phone call I got to talk to y'all about. We said, all right, who called you? You know what I mean? And look, his house had already been shot up by every gang inside this particular area. His house had been shot up like about a half a dozen times. The dude was so wild that he got tired of his house getting shot up by every gang in the city. He said the only gang that didn't shoot his house up was our gang. So he shot his own house up. So he could say, well, now our gang shot my house up too. That's how wild and absurd things were when we were young in the 90s, in the 80s. Anyway, so when we meeting, he says, I got a phone call from a guy who said he was in the Aryan Brotherhood. And he said that we're fighting the wrong cause. He said, because we're acting like we were, black, and, which was fine and everything while we were on the streets. He was saying, but once we got to prison, that stuff wasn't going to fly. So he was saying, prepare ourselves now, because when we get to prison, it's going to be the Aryan Brotherhood. And he was like, we should start, rethinking what we're doing now. And excuse me, we should start rethinking what we're doing now and get rid of all the non-white members that we had and quit claiming Bloods and, start a, neo-Nazi gang. And so we listen, and you listen, and you got to keep in mind, I'm not all white. My mama's half Japanese, you know what I mean? So my grandma's Japanese, so I'm also Asian, and they ain't no Japanese. They ain't no Japanese around. They got Vietnamese, they got Chinese, but I ain't never knew no Japanese other than me and my cousins. So we are sitting there debating, and we have a vote, and it was a quick vote. Not one person was like, we're going to get on board with this. When we get to prison, we get to prison. Now, we are already been in juvenile detention, and in juvenile detention in Louisiana, it's just where you're from. If you're from uptown, you're from uptown New Orleans. If you're from Shreveport, you're from Shreveport. Now, Shreveport's a whole different story, because as far as I know, those gangs, the Bloods, the Crips, the Gangster Disciples, and Latin Kings, and all that, they were actually sanctioned. Vice Lords, they were sanctioned from Chicago and California, because Shreveport was considered the baby LA and baby Chicago at the time. So a lot of those dudes were actually sanctioned by actual members from California and Chicago. Now, back to the gang meeting we would have to discuss the conversation we got about the Aryan Brotherhood calling us up and telling us when we got to prison, we wasn't going to be claiming none of that, because the blacks were going to be coming after us and we were going to have to fight whites. We're going to have to stick with whites. And we didn't know that. Like I said, even in juvenile detention, whites would still have to fight to show to prove themselves, up in LTI, which is Louisiana Training Institution. That's where the juveniles went. I never made it to LTI, but I was in juvenile detention. And I've been into some juvenile facilities, just not LTI, which is basically the prison for juveniles. Now, my brother went. I had cousins went. I had most of my friends went. So I know all the stories, fighting for benches. They called it benches. So if you were from the West Bank and Marrero, you sat on a certain bench. If you was from uptown New Orleans, from St. Thomas, you sat on a certain bench. You know what I mean? If you was from Florida, you sat on a certain bench. And that's just the way it was. If Shreveport, they sat on a certain bench. So you had to fight to catch your bench or you sat on the floor. And that's just the way it was in the different juvenile training institutions that were inside Louisiana. So we have this discussion. He tells us what this guy said, who said he was from the Aryan Brotherhood, who calls us. And, nothing else gets said about it. We move on. He never did call back. It was a one-time phone call to have the discussion. Fast forward to I am inside of Hunt Correctional Center Diagnostic. And about 2 or 3 cells down from me, they have this white dude. There's 2 white dudes in the cell. Both of them were solid dudes. One was from Louisiana, a big cornbread, solid white dude he was a crazy dude. He actually got, his story is different, so I have to tell a story another day. But the one dude who was in the cell with him is the one who claimed he was Aryan Brotherhood. I do remember his last name, but I don't remember his first name, and I'm not going to put his name out there because I don't know, and I don't want to start no stuff because I don't know who's who. I don't know, any of this true members who claim or don't claim to be in the Aryan Brotherhood. But he asked me, and me and him talked during yard call, when we walked up and down the tier, through diagnostics, when we're waiting to get seen by this person and that person, we discussed, and, we chopped it up a little bit. He wrote me a couple kites. He told me to send down my Bible. I sent him my Bible, and he had highlighted a bunch of verses that proved that white people were the real chosen people and not the Jews. And so I remember, I'm interested because I'm in prison. I got to belong to something, I got to protect myself. I've already seen that, things could be crazy for young white dudes. And I'm 19 years old when I get into the Department of Corrections. And so I sent him my Bible. He's sending me kites back. So I'm interested. But the one area that he really loses me in is when he starts talking about the Bible and the Jews really being Aryans. I'm like, yeah, man, I'm young enough to know I had already given my life to Jesus even before I started. So I was never going to buy into that ever. You know what I mean? So I believe the Bible for what it says and for what it is. And I believe the authors. Anyway, he's telling me that, one day when I get up the road, I'm going to have to get in fights. And I've already been in fights, so he knows. He said, but when I get up the road, I'm going to get in fights. And he's from the feds. He had just did 20 years in the feds. And he was coming back up like a 5 or 10 year sentence for the state of Louisiana that he had time in. So he finished his Fed time. And supposedly when he was in the feds is when he got into the Aryan Brotherhood. And he's telling me all the stuff you got to do to get into the Aryan Brotherhood. And he sends me down a kite. And eventually the kite, we go back and forth. And he says, little brother, that's what he called me. He says, say, little brother, whenever you get up the road and you get tested and you handle your business, he said, one day you're going to get your lightning bolts. When you get your lightning bolts, wear them with pride. Now, listen, a lot of dudes in Louisiana got lightning bolts, and we'll talk about that story another time. But he's telling me this, and so this is my first time meeting someone who actually claims to be a federal Aryan brother. That was this dude. Now, did I believe him at 19 years old? I believed him. I think he was telling the truth, Looking back all these years, decades later, do I still believe him? I never seen him again. I don't know what prison he got transferred. I went from Hunt to David Wade, where I also ran into 2 other dudes who were Aryan brothers from the feds who were doing time in David Wade. 2 big white dudes, biker looking dudes. And they came from the feds too, and they were backing up state time. And this is in northern Louisiana. These northern Louisiana white dudes are different than southern Louisiana white dudes, right? And I never did talk to these dudes when I was in Wade. Like I said, man, I still, when I got to Wade, I got in some fights. I didn't stay there long because it's in the north. Eventually, I worked my way back down to southern prisons in southern Louisiana. WCI, DCI, but up north it was Wade, And so I was in Wade, and that was my second experience with some Aryan Brotherhood members. And I talked to a third dude. These 2 dudes, they were in a different yard. And so I didn't really talk to them, but they were pointed out to me from another dude who was not an Aryan Brotherhood member, but he was familiar with it. He knew those dudes, and he was a white dude down for the cause. You know what I mean? And he was telling me about them 2 dudes. And this dude was solid too. He used to do that artwork. And so I talked to him, and in David Wade, they had a lot of, what I would call, some neo-Nazi types and some white supremacists. They had that up there in David Wade Correctional Center. They also had one dude, I'll tell that story later, who was one of the OGs from back in the Gangster Disciples. And you got to think, this is in the 90s. I'm 19 years old when I hit the compound at David Wade Correctional Center. And this dude who supposedly is a shot, he's an OG, should I say, not shot caller. He's an OG for the Gangster Disciples. Supposedly he was, one of the original members. And at this time in the 90s, this dude's in his 40s or 50s at the time. So this dude in all likelihood is no longer alive. But he was real enough to where I know on the prison yard, that dude who was with the Gangster Disciples, who they said was OG, you couldn't get next to him without youngsters crowding you. You had to get permission to go talk to this dude when he was sitting on the bleachers. And I actually did have conversations with this dude. I never spoke to those two dudes who were in Aryan Brotherhood because they were in a different yard. But this other dude was on the same yard with me. And he found out, I used to read a lot. I always read. And he saw me reading some interesting stuff. And he was interested. So he told, his minions to come tell me he wanted to holler at me. So I went holler at him. He's like, "Say you reading that stuff, huh?" I said, "Yeah." I forgot what book I was reading at the time, but it was something he was interested. It was a prison book or something. And he said, "You got a lot of knowledge for a little young dude, huh?" And this is a black dude, and it's all his people are black, and he's talking to me. I guess just the way I carry myself, he was interested. So he was trying to put me on his literature, and he was trying to spit game to me. I guess trying to on a slick see what I was about, peep me out, so see if he wanted to recruit me. I don't know what his play was because I eventually got transferred. But anyway, doing time in the Louisiana prisons, that was the only dude I ever met who actually claimed to be with the Federal Aryan Brotherhood. Now, in Louisiana, I met a bunch of dudes who claimed to be Texas Aryan Brotherhood. You got to think, Louisiana's right next to Texas. So I probably met at least a half a dozen or to maybe 10 dudes who actually claimed to be, AB Texas. And I believe them to be true because they all knew each other too, from Texas prison system. They know each other. They wound up in Louisiana running stuff back and forth across state lines. They got family live here, vice versa. Louisiana got family in Texas. So Louisiana and Texas is kind of, right there. You can do time from Louisiana to Texas, vice versa. But that is my personal story with the Aryan Brotherhood. Like I said, you be the judge for yourself. I don't know if this dude was really a sanctioned member, but he said he was. And he called me little brother, and I wasn't no Aryan Brotherhood member, nor am I to this day, nor was I ever. When I got to the state prison, yeah, he's right. Whites had to fight and stand up on their own, and it was a different game. But still in Louisiana prisons, there's no organized politics. It's still mainly where you from. And it's probably always going to be like that in Louisiana. If you're from a certain area geographically in the state, that's kind of who you stick with. And it's lone wolf. If you fight and handle your business, your people will stand up and stand out for you. If you don't, then that's just it. But there's no organized shot caller who's telling everybody else what to do. You can do what you want to do. You're your own man. And ain't nobody going to knock that in Louisiana. Now, you can argue that the political structure of shot callers is beneficial to the entire group because a lot of stuff that happens in these southern prisons doesn't happen in West Coast prisons or in the feds. But in southern prisons, you know what I mean? You can get victimized and ganged up by, as a white dude, blacks can crowd you. You know what I mean? And somebody might not step in, and you can get outnumbered. It can happen. I got jumped, but that's just the way it is. And that's my story about the Louisiana Aryan Brotherhood. And it's, say what it is. They got dudes in there who, but nobody's really claiming it. So it's just a different thing. Like I said, but they do have Texas Aryan Brotherhood here in Louisiana. But that's all I got to say about that. That's my story. Now you be the judge, you make the judgment. And while you're at it, give me a like and subscribe to the Pen and The Shank, the most unusual and unique crime and prison experience on YouTube. Man, let's get it.